I would like to welcome you all to the 34th Annual Economic Outlook Seminar, conducted by the Bureau of Business and Economic Research. My name is Patrick Barkey. I became director of the Bureau last July, and I'll be moderating today's program. We're pleased to have with us for a formal welcome the Provost and Vice President for Academic Affairs at the University of Montana, Missoula. Would you please join me in welcoming Royce Engstrom?
Thank you, Pat. Good morning. It's a real pleasure to be here with you today for the Economic Outlook Seminar. I've only been in town for a couple of years, and I did have the pleasure last year of attending this event and staying for much of the day and found it extraordinarily fascinating. My background is not the economy. I'm a chemist by training and turned administrator, and so it was pretty interesting to hear the economists talk last year, and of course this year it has to be much more interesting regardless of your part in it. It certainly is a fascinating time that we're going through. Fascinating, not in a particularly good way, but fascinating nonetheless. So it's a real honor for me to welcome you here this morning and to thank the folks that are responsible for putting this together. I understand that this is a whirlwind tour of the state, and they've already done one, at least in Helena, that was very well received, and what a tremendous service to the state this activity is. The Bureau has a long-standing tradition of providing these seminars, beginning back in 1975. And it's important to note that these seminars are a joint effort. They represent a joint effort that involve the work of quite a variety of people around the Montana university system and beyond. So we have speakers from the Institute for Tourism and Recreation Research, the Western Transportation Institute, Montana State University in Bozeman, Montana State University in Billings. It's a collaborative effort to showcase the talent that we have in this area of economic forecasting and to provide you, the business people and the citizens and policymakers of the state, with information needed to make decisions. The Missoula Chamber of Commerce has been an important part of helping this event come off, and I want to give a special thanks to Dean Larry Gianchetta, the Dean of the School of Business, who I'll be spending the rest of the day with in a Dean's retreat until about 6 this evening. A number of other sponsors for the Missoula event need to be recognized: Northwestern Energy, State Fund, Pacific Steel and Recycling, and the First Interstate Bank. But especially I want to thank Pat and all of the staff at the Bureau. I've been able to observe these folks at work during the past couple of years, and they are tremendously dedicated not only to their discipline, the discipline of economics, but I think dedicated to the state and providing service that will help the state and the nation move forward, especially in these tough times. So I very much appreciate the work that they do, Pat, and all of your colleagues. Thank you so much. So have a great day, and I look forward to hearing the outcome of today's event. But I think what's important here that we all take note of is that these are extraordinarily challenging times at every level. The global connectedness of the economy has never shown itself as it has in these past 5 or 6 months. So we've all learned a great deal about how the economy works, how it doesn't work, and what the problems are. So it's a fascinating time. Thank you for coming, and have a great day.
Thank you very much, Provost Engstrom. I'm sure you'll agree with me these are not normal economic times. There are more questions today about the economy than any time in the last 20 years. And we're delighted to have brought together for you a full slate of experts who you can cross-examine and who we invite to share their insights with us. By way of further introduction, let me tell you a little bit more about the Bureau for those of you who may not be familiar with us. The Bureau of Business and Economic Research is the research arm of the University of Montana School of Business Administration. The Bureau began? Help me out there. Where's my spell checker? The Bureau has begun, I'll go with that, in 1948, and since then has been involved in a wide variety of activities, including economic analysis and forecasting, survey research, and information dissemination. We also published the Montana Business Quarterly, to which many of you now subscribe. You will notice some additional information on the Bureau's work on the inside of your program folder, and we invite you to contact us if we can provide you or your organization with any information or assistance. We have a number of sponsors for our seminars, as you can see. I would like to take a moment now to individually thank them. I would like to recognize Northwestern Energy, Pacific Steel and Recycling, the Montana State Fund, and First Interstate Bank. The sponsorship of these fine companies and organizations is one of the major reasons why we're able to bring you these seminars, and we greatly appreciate their support. Thank you. We also have a number of organizations we work with to provide continuing education credit for this seminar. And if you'll give me a second, I would like to read off those organizations. They are Montana Society of Certified Public Accountants, Institute of Certified Management Accountants, Society of American Foresters, Montana Department of Education Teacher Professional Renewal Units Program, the Montana Board of Real Estate Appraisers, Montana Board of Realty Regulation, the Montana Insurance Continuing Education Program, Montana Board of Social Work Examiners and Professional Counselors, and the Montana Board of Nursing Home Administrators. All these organizations have approved our Outlook seminars for continuing education credit. Welcome to those of you attending for credit. We should have your certificates for you within 4 to 6 weeks. If you do not get your certificates, please give us a call and we'll make sure that you do. In this program, we will look at, as we always have, the Montana economy, local economies, and major industry sectors within the Montana economy. We've allowed questions after each presenter, so please hold your questions until that time. Most of our presenters have PowerPoint presentations. Those should be available by the end of next week at the Bureau's website listed on your program folder. Getting now started on the program, we want to begin this morning by focusing on one of the major challenges for moving the state's economy ahead, and that's the transportation system. We sometimes take for granted that billions of dollars worth of infrastructure that support the movement of people and goods within and through our state, the infrastructure that got us in our seats this morning, for example. Keeping up with the needs of people and businesses in transportation and finding a way to pay for it is essential if Montana is going to remain competitive and grow. To talk to us about Montana's transportation future, we're extremely pleased to have with us the director of the Western Transportation Institute at Montana State University. Would you please join me in welcoming Steve Albert?
Good morning. Thank you, Pat, for the opportunity. We started this about 4 years ago, I'd say, 3 or 4 years ago, saying, what could one of the future Economic Outlook seminars be about? And transportation was viewed as an opportunity. Never in our wildest dreams did we think we would have so much exposure, so much political insight being given toward the issue, of course, and associated with the economic stimulus package and how transportation plays in this. So the timing of this is wonderful. I'd like to really thank Pat and Paul Polson for thinking broadly and working with Montana State University. I think this is a good testimony of how two universities can actually play in the same sandbox. Maybe not the same football field, but the same sandbox. So what I'm going to talk to you about is transportation in Montana, nationally, regionally, locally. But first, I thought it might be worth mentioning who is the Western Transportation Institute. We've been around for around 15 years. We were founded by the California Department of Transportation, the Montana Department of Transportation, and MSU as a national transportation center focusing on rural issues. You ask, California? California really does have large segments of rural needs, and when Caltrans, the California Department of Transportation, started saying, all the money was going to large urban areas, they said, we really need some national center to focus and highlight what are the rural needs, what are the rural opportunities, and what are some of the rural transportation solutions. I think the Caltrans representative also liked to fish in Montana as well. But, so they founded WTI as part of the College of Engineering. We are a USDOT nationally designated transportation center of about 80 staff, $8 million a year in research. You can see about 4% of that comes from Montana. So I think we do a very good job of embodying economic development and bringing money to Montana to address Montana needs, which may or may not be paid for the originating funds in Montana. Our projects are very diverse. Our projects include partners from 35 states and 6 countries, and we generally look at solving real-world problems. Our focus is relating to safety, driver behavior, infrastructure, maintenance needs, winter conditions, animal vehicle collisions or road ecology, corrosion, very broad, but we try to look at the world maybe through a bigger lens than some of the operating agencies, and then also to be able to look at the interrelationships of the issues relating to the driver, the vehicle, traffic, infrastructure, environment, and society, and the trade-offs of those in terms of problems and solutions. And we think that gives us a specific niche to look at rural needs. So what do I want to talk to you about today? Kind of 4 issues. Transportation and the economy, key factors driving transportation demand, some of the challenges we face nationally and locally, as well as opportunities in the future. If you look at transportation historically, it has always been the catalyst for society's movement, migration, and changes, whether it be the Roman highways, Native Americans, Lewis and Clark, or the interstate system. Transportation is always at the forefront, as it has been in the past, and I believe will be in the future, to our economic future. But we're facing a huge, huge challenge. When it comes to fossil fuels, we're coming to the point where where the demand is exceeding supply, and that's coming very quickly, and we do not have any near-term, quite frankly, or long-term solutions. When you look at how transportation is funded, it's funded through fuel tax, and the Highway Trust Fund is running out of money. The trust fund was established in 1956 to build and maintain our national transportation system, but it is running out of money, and right now, through a commission that was established, has said that not only is it running out of money, but we're 21% short of just maintaining the system, and if you look at future demands for the system, we're 35% behind. Myself and Montana DOT Director Jim Lynch provided testimony to this commission in Minneapolis here some months ago, and it was kind of scary to hear the ideas coming out of Washington, D.C. to solve these problems that had nothing to do with rural America. So what is transportation and the economy? I think when you look at transportation, it affects both the production, it affects people's mobility, and it generates revenue. If you look at just from construction jobs, for every $1 million spent, it generates about 27 jobs. If you look at productivity, including the vehicle manufacturers, it generates about $44 billion per year that travels through the state of Montana, either through freight movement as well as vehicle manufacturers. And when you look at it at a household level, tourism plays a huge part of creating jobs, opportunities, and tax and revenues coming into the state. One of the issues when people think of transportation, they generally think selfishly, including me, about your vehicle. And what is the cost to operate your vehicle? It costs about 16 cents to operate your vehicle. When you add the ownership of that vehicle as well as the operation, it increases to about 27%. But transportation is more than just your vehicle. You have to drive on a road. You got to pay for pollution, you got to pay for land use changes, you got to pay for parking to be built, and that increases it up to about 94 cents per mile. We talk about many times issues between roads and transit. For all you transit lovers, I'm sure you'll love me saying this. Subsidy also includes the road system that you drive on, and that is comparable to transit. So what are some of the key factors coming down the pike? If you look across this room, by the time 2030 approaches, 1 in 4 of us will be over 65. I'll let that sink in just for a second. So from a transportation perspective, what are we doing locally, regionally, nationally to look at this aging population that's coming down the pike? How is it going to affect transportation between transportation and your home, transportation and health services, transportation and hospitals? It's going to have a huge impact. Also, if we look at the amount of freight that's being moved on our roadways nationally and within Montana, it's about to increase significantly. And if you hear what the Western Governors Association is talking about in terms of ex-urban migration and population shifts, they're expecting 42 million more people to be coming to the Rocky Mountain West. And where are those people going to be driving? 2-lane rural highways. If you look at how many deaths happen on 2-lane rural highways versus interstate, if you drive on a 2-lane rural highway, you're 4 times more likely to get killed. Why? The roads are unforgiving. You run off the road, you're going to die. Sobering for the morning, isn't it? How many people have hit an animal? Raise your hands. A large part of you. If you look at the issues relating to wildlife and vehicle collisions, it's increasing. If you add up the amount of money that's being lost when you hit an animal, whether it be from your vehicle, whether it be for carcass removal, insurance, et cetera, it's ranging in a worst case scenario, and this is for a moose, between $8,000 and $30,000 per incident. A deer would be a little bit less, but it has huge economic impacts. We have been just finished in the last about 6 months a report that went to the U.S. Department of Transportation, Secretary of Transportation, that then went to Congress to look at this issue. And if you look at how many crashes happen nationally, that line is fairly flat. But if you look at how many wildlife vehicle collisions are happening, that line is going up and up and up, and has increased over the last few years by 50%. There's a lot of work going on nationally. There's work even going on in Montana on US 93. If you've seen the stuff in Banff, Canada, that's WTI's efforts with the crossing structures. That's now coming to the lower 48. So there are solutions, but it is becoming a big problem. If you look at rural transportation nationally, rural roads comprise about 80% of the road miles. They carry about 40% of the vehicle miles of travel, and 80% of those roads are 2-lane or less. There are real differences, though, between urban and rural, and I know this is kind of a hard slide to see. We generally may travel a little bit less, but drive further, own more vehicles, and drive those vehicles a little bit more into a mode choice because we don't have public transportation. But one of the issues that is real different is safety. If you drive in rural America versus urban America, you're about 2.5 times more likely to get killed. That's because in an urban area, you may have a rear-end collision, bump your head. In a rural environment, you may run off the road and they may not find you for a week. The next national challenge is relating to freight, where freight represents about 3% of a gross domestic product. We are seeing over the next 20 years or so an increase of about 50% in terms of freight on our road system. Trucks generally, probably in Montana, are around 25% of the traffic stream. They'll probably be increasing to probably as much as 50% or more. So this is becoming a big issue. It's also becoming an issue because Montana is predominantly a through state, and trucks which are in Montana move most of the goods and services. So the volumes are going up, but more and more are going through our state. There are strategies out there, and let me say something about WTI just for a second. My background, I'm not a research professor. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. It's just I'm not. But my background comes from managing the Houston transportation system for about 12 years, as well as being a consultant and working at another university. And so my ideas are much more applicable than producing a report that sits on someone's shelf. And so much of our focus and some of the strategies that I'm talking about here are applied solutions that we know, because of best management practices, they work somewhere else. One of the issues that we are facing is, how do you pay for transportation if fuel costs can't cover it? So some of the strategies that are being talked about, such as in Oregon, are road user fees, where you are charged based on the time of day that you travel because of peak periods and traffic congestion and other things, as well as the distance that you travel. So when you pull into the gas pump, that's how you're going to be charged, not on a standard fuel tax, but on one that's much more variable based on the distance and time in which you travel. Does that make sense for Montana? Maybe, maybe not. We drive further. We have less options. One of the other issues is, if you are involved in a crash, when you look at the data from crashes, 90% of the problem with crashes is who? The driver. You, me. It's not the road operated by some government agency. It's not the environment. It's the driver who tends to overdrive the roadway. So when we look at problems relating to safety, we have to first look into the mirror. Some of the solutions that have worked in other places to get the attention of the driver to slow down, to drive better, are use of dynamic message signs. So if you're coming up to a curve, it will tell you that the curve is coming up, that your speed is too high, to slow down, and to affect a modification in your behavior. These things, when we generally find in rural America, 60% of the fatalities are in rural United States, and about 40% of those are single vehicle run off the road. They happen a lot at curves, and so we've looked at strategies that can affect your driver behavior to slow down, to drive based on weather conditions and road conditions. There are also solutions relating to detecting animals in high migration routes, or where we have a lot of crashes, and they have been shown, that we've done, as well as work in Europe that we've done, that they can reduce 90% of all animal vehicle collisions where they're put in. One of the opportunities, I think, and Norman Nickerson will probably talk about this later, is tourism. When you look at how much money is being generated in tourism coming into Montana and generating about $500 million in tax revenues and about 45,000 jobs per year, it's a big economic indicator that we need to figure out how to leverage. And one of the ideas that Norma came up with some years ago, and that we've borrowed from University of Montana, believe it or not, someone borrowed a good idea from University of Montana to MSU, yes, was how could we use technology in the states of Canada to Mexico along I-15, Nevada, Arizona, Utah, whatever the states are, to keep people one more day in some local area through the use of in-vehicle systems to give you information, or dynamic message signs that might give you information, or something that would enrich your visitor experience. And I still think that's a great opportunity for Montana to generate more money. Other strategies also include ride sharing. I think there's a great opportunity for ride sharing of carpooling and real-time matching to get people out of single occupant vehicles to share a ride, and also then to reduce the operating expenses of your vehicle. It costs a lot to operate one vehicle, but if you can share that, there are greater opportunities. The other opportunity, I think, is in public transportation, especially as we see this aging bubble coming down the road, that to begin to create regional systems that link local communities so people can move between region to region, local to local. We have been doing this both with Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming of creating a tour district that moves fleets of vehicles, let's say in Glacier when they need it in the summer, down to somewhere else in the winter, like Big Sky, who needs vehicles, so that we can economize on fleets to provide public transportation and share the fleet similar to what they do with ag tractors moving from the south to the north to work on crops. The other area, and I think this is near and dear to Missoula, quite frankly, is to begin to put more institutions in a traffic management center so there can be better coordination of traffic signals, special events like football traffic, weather conditions, to put them all within one building to manage things in real time and stop thinking about transportation just as construction and maintenance, but transportation in that we have to operate the system. I think there's real opportunities in transportation, and it does become the catalyst for economic development. I think there's greater management needs of transportation than just building and maintaining systems, and I think there are some great opportunities to affect driver behavior and safety to stop the spending of money that we really don't need to spend by people not getting into accidents, user fees, freight movement, travel and tourism information, transit and traffic management. I'd be glad to entertain any questions, and thank you for your time.
Questions for Steve? Hey. Norma. Norma.
I forget to ask this. How can you have less than 2 lanes on a road?
Good question. Well, I think you say, the question is, how can you have less than 2 lanes? You really can't. But I think saying 2 lanes means, well, it's not 4 lanes, or it's not 3 lanes, and which has a passing lane. If it's just 1 lane, well, that's a problem. One thing I will mention, there are WTI annual reports in the back if you're interested in what we're doing to solve real-world problems. Feel free to pick them up. And I did not talk about air service. I tried to keep my remarks more to surface transportation, so I appreciate your time and look forward to talking to you.
More questions? You might be.
There's one over there.
What are the possibilities of trees being that from area
The question was, what's the possibilities of trains coming to Missoula? Or through the west. There is, Hal Fossum is here. Hal, the Montana Department of Transportation is currently doing a feasibility study for train service, passenger train service in Montana. And Hal can address that. There are issues, of course. Hal, are you here? There are questions regarding not only the cost of the service, but the users, how many users that will generate. And Hal, do you want to take that question? Hal Fossum from the Montana Department of Transportation. It's a good question for him.
Good morning. I'm Hal Fossum. I'm an economist and a freight planner with the Department of Transportation. The department is this season working to finalize an update to our rail plan. As part of that rail plan, we're looking at passenger rail service and the resumption of that service along the southern route. We're looking at 2 main scenarios. One is Missoula to Billings and resumption of that. We're working closely with Amtrak, which has already come out and assessed that line, which is largely Montana Rail Link line. We're also examining the possibilities of linking that up from Sandpoint through Missoula, Billings, and up to Williston, where it would diverge from the Highline route. Also, in the recent rail safety bill that passed through Congress last fall, there has been money and interest specifically designated for the resumption of the Hiawatha route, which puts Montana sort of ahead of the game in assessing those possibilities. Now, as we explore the possibilities of resumption of passenger service along the southern route, the main questions are track improvements, because sharing the road with freight, it tends to be a fairly busy freight corridor. We may need to expand the track improvements. Of course, the depots and the loading facilities, the rolling stock and the train sets need to be costed out, and the continuing operating subsidy necessary. So those are the four main areas of expense. Amtrak is pretty good at modeling demand. So we'll be looking at that, and you can look for that in our rail plan update in the coming season or two. Thanks.
Thank you. More questions? Yes, sir.
If I can paraphrase, transportation funding is going down, but what's going on in Washington, D.C. with the stimulus bill, and is it a Band-Aid approach or is it a long-term fix? Is that fair? The stimulus bill is to get projects going. You've all heard the term shovel-ready, and to start building those projects. A large part of them are obviously maintenance, but a big part are also new projects that are on the books. And I think Jim Lynch, the director at MDT, is going to speak to that at lunch a little bit, so he can give you a little bit more of the update. There is a lot of the stimulus bill obviously is transportation focused, because they know that will have a direct impact on jobs. I think I heard this morning $300 billion of that was transportation related, so about half maybe is transportation. I think that's good for Montana, and a large number of those projects come here, and Governor Schweitzer has submitted that. Other questions?
Yeah, considering there's a population growth that's occurring on the 93 corridor, what plans are in place for light rail, since there is rail bed all the way from Darby to Eureka, except for the area around Flathead Lake?
It's hard for me to speak on behalf of the Montana Department of Transportation, so let me suggest that you talk to Hal Fossum on the side, so we don't have to keep bringing him up. And
He'll be here at lunch.
Hal will be here at lunch, and so will MDT director. And I don't mean that as a glib answer, honestly. It's just, I think it's better for that agency to respond to that specific question. I didn't mean to shut off questions either.
Any other questions we can avoid?
I'm doing a good job of that, aren't I?
Center in the back.
The question was, how do you affect behavioral changes, or what we would call in transportation mode shift, so public transportation is used more? I think it's site by site. I'll give you an example of it, but this may not be quite applicable to Missoula. We just did some work in Grand Canyon National Park. For you who have been to Tusayan, the outlying community outside of the south entrance, where we used real-time traveler information and to get people out of their cars to take transit. And we increased transit ridership by 50% just because people were giving better information. Generally, you find not only in urban, but I would say rural, that 98% of the people have not been on a bus since they've been on a yellow school bus. And so you have to affect, I think, the better way to make changes in mode shift is by giving either better access or better information, so people have some comfort level that when they go outside their door, they go to the bus stop, that there will be a bus there. There are technologies in place, like at bus stops or on your cable channel that says when is the next bus arriving. And since buses can have global positioning systems, they know where the fleet is, so you know exactly when you go out there, the bus is going to be there. You don't have to wait in the cold as long. So I think part of the importance, at least that I've seen in terms of getting mode shift, is by better information.
Great. Next question. Yes, sir, in the back.
I thought it was interesting to hear that WTI was founded because rural communities in California felt like the city weren't giving them a fair shake. In Missoula, frankly, our experience is the opposite. About 11% of the population get about 2% of the gas tax money. We have to get a greater percentage of people miles traveled in the population. What models have you seen in other states for an equitable share of transportation money between urban and rural areas?
I'll build on the California example, but I don't think there'd be some in the audience who would like this. I think you can take it from two different approaches: the money that you generate and how much you get back, or how much you control the decisions in terms of what projects are funded. In California, they passed legislatively a proposition that basically said in the Metropolitan Planning Organization, or in the rural MPO basically, that they were responsible for determining what projects move forward. May not have controlled the money, but it was up to them to control what projects got implemented versus the state DOT.
Yes.
Well, when problems are presented to limit the ability to expand GPW rates so we can have more efficient freight transport.
Was the question, what plans are underway to expand gross vehicle weight of trucks? There's a lot of discussion nationally. Anyone from the freight industry here? Raise your hand. There is a lot of discussion about longer trucks, and there's a lot of research that's being done in terms of the effect of those longer trucks that then can carry more weight and their impact to the pavement. MDT led a lot of research as well as constituent building in the West, and I think the jury is still out. There's still a lot of some state DOTs say they don't want longer trucks because they feel they're less safe, and also that they have a higher degradation to the pavement than shorter, single unit trucks. Canada, on the other hand, would really like longer trucks, especially as it supports moving from Alberta south. But there is a lot of discussion going on that. I think given the time, Pat, you got time?
Going in the other direction, is there any opportunity to stretch some of the back of the trains and small roads and expand the private sector?
I personally feel that the question was, if longer trucks may be an issue, is there an opportunity for backhauling? Is that fair?
In any sense, whether it's long trucks or not, whether instead of trying to get more freight runs to the roads, get off the road.
Oh, right. So the question was, how can you then, if you have longer, can you move trucks and the containers from trucks to, let's say, rail, so you're looking at intermodal opportunities? And yes, there is. In fact, we just completed a study for MDT on looking at those intermodal opportunities. And it is kind of scary, I think, when you look at freight movement in Montana, that we're predominantly not the originating point, not the destination point, but the state that bridges other states. And most of the freight that is moved between Seattle and Chicago comes through Montana. So I think if we don't solve the intermodal opportunity issue to move it to freight to rail, or backhauling, which means putting stuff on containers that are moving through Montana, If you look at how the railroad industry has worked, they generally like high volume, and Montana's not a high volume state in terms of generating freight.
Okay, well, the other possibility is there, Seattle, since Seattle, Chicago is to agree, or the states around us to agree, to try and keep that on.
I think that's part of the intermodal question. The question was, how can you maybe move the freight to shorter distances on neighboring states that have higher volume origination? And I think that is an opportunity, but it's many times it still comes down to economies of scale, and that's generally the way business seems to be moving these days, is all economies of scale.
One more question. Yes, sir.
You talked in one of your slides about production of oil and the limitations over time in terms of fuel. Have you all looked at the Pickett's plan, the legitimacy of converting natural gas to use as a primary fuel for our transportation fleet?
We have looked at alternative fuels for actually state fleets and beyond. I don't remember the results of that, but I think there are huge opportunities for that. What at least I've known about alternative fuels is in working with some of the folks from INEL, Idaho National Environmental Labs, was that the issues are not the use of the alternative fuels as much it is where are they produced, and are there stations then that can be replicated across the state so that when you're driving down the road you can still go to these places, each gas station for alternative fuels, versus just having one alternative fueling station in one town, where then if you drive outside that town you can't get that alternative fuel. And I'm not an expert in alternative fuels. I hope you can understand that.
Okay. Well, I think Steve will probably be around at the break, take some more questions. Let's give him a thanks for
This is the portion of our program where we turn now to look specifically at global, national, statewide, and local area economic conditions and make our forecasts. I'm very happy to introduce a very familiar face with perhaps a slightly unfamiliar title, BBER Research Associate, and of course former Director of the Bureau, Paul Polzin. Paul.
Thank you very much, Pat. You know, retirement's really not bad at all. It really gives you a lot of flexibility. Last October, my wife and I went to Italy. You know, all the art, everywhere you look was art and painting. And as you know, in a painting, everything is symbolic. Something means something, or everything means something. So maybe we can start off by looking at this famous painting by Remington. The storm, the dark clouds and the rain, that probably symbolizes our bad economic times. That lightning bolt in the background, that's Bear Stearns or Lehman Brothers or one of those events. The cattle milling around, scared, going in all directions. That probably represents Montanans who are concerned about their economy. The two riders who are trying to calm everybody down and get the cattle going in the right direction. That's the Bureau of Business and Economic Research. And finally, when I was going through this with some of my colleagues, they pointed out one other piece of symbolism. The horse, the part of the horse, you know, right by the tail there, that probably symbolizes me. Now, if you were expecting a lot of jokes today, that is about it. 2008 was quite a year. Things are now very different than they were a year ago. And we need to look very carefully at what has happened over the last 12 months to try and understand how we got to where we are right now. At last year's Economic Outlook seminar, we knew that the U.S. economy was going into a recession. but the forecasts were that it would be a relatively short and a relatively mild recession, sort of like the recessions of 2001 and 1990. The economists thought that this recession was going to be concentrated in just a couple of areas: housing, financial services, and autos. And financial services and autos are not very important here in Montana. We thought that developing countries like China would not be affected by this recession, that they would continue to grow rapidly. And finally, President Bush had just proposed a significant stimulus plan. Here in Montana, we were very optimistic. We thought that this national recession was going to miss Montana for the third time in a row. Only the wood products industry appeared to be impacted by this recession. July. That's when we do our mid-year update. The financial crisis had worsened. Major firms like Bear Stearns were going belly up. Here in Montana, we had the first inkling of weakness. Construction and real estate started to nosedive. But we weren't really surprised because we knew that construction and real estate in Montana was bucking the national trend. We did, however, start to hear of other factors or factors in other industries. But there was also some very good news in July. Wheat was at a record high, and this indicated a strong farm sector. Now, we did revise our forecast downward a bit in July to take into account this nosedive, this decrease in construction and real estate. September. The world started to fall apart. More failures on Wall Street. Commodity and energy prices started to plummet. The recession spread to the EU and Japan, and even the developing countries were starting to slow down. Here in Montana, we found out that the tourist season was not as good as we had anticipated. We had the first news of weakness in Montana state tax revenue. Construction and real estate continues to plummet. But we got the first news of possible layoffs outside of the wood products industry. But just to confound things, employment growth in September remained very strong. December. By now, it's obvious that this recession is not going to be mild and short. Consumer sentiment plummets. The Christmas season turned out to be a disaster. The experts are now talking about simultaneous recessions around the world. Commodity and energy prices are falling through the floor. Here in Montana, we get layoff and plant closure announcements outside of the wood products industry. We get layoff announcements in mining and manufacturing. Construction and real estate continue to plummet. Job growth does turn negative. Obviously, this recession is not going to bypass Montana. Now, there are a lot of stories out there about this recession being the worst since the Great Depression. We have to keep in mind that recessions are different. There are mild recessions, like the ones in 2001 and 1990. They last less than a year, and the unemployment rate maxes out at about 6%. There are intermediate recessions, like the ones in the 1970s and the ones in the 1980s. They last about a year, year and a half. The unemployment rate maxes out at about 8 to 9 or 10%. Finally, there is the 1930s, where the recession is years long and unemployment is somewhere between 15 and 25%. The current recession began in December 2007. It's forecast to end, or the bottom is forecast to be reached sometime during July, August, or September of 2009. That makes it at no less than 19 months long. The unemployment rate is forecast to reach about 9%. So obviously, this recession belongs in the intermediate category. It might be the worst since the Great Depression, but it certainly doesn't fall in the same class as the Great Depression. Now, those of you who took Econ 101 remember that the federal government has basically two policy tools, two ways to fight recession. There's monetary policy, which has to do with interest rates and the money supply, and there's fiscal policy, which has to do with taxes and spending. So what's President Obama going to do? First of all, monetary policy is probably out of the question. Interest rates are already at a minimum, and even though the Federal Reserve is making some attempts at buying mortgages and going into some innovative areas, the role of monetary policy is probably quite limited. So that leaves fiscal policy. And there are two components to fiscal policy: increased government spending and decreased taxes. And it looks like President Obama is proposing both. Now, we're going to have to wait and see just exactly what policy or what bill makes it through Congress. But right now, the magic number seems to be somewhere around $800 billion, about 5% of GDP. Now, as of now, President Obama's economic plan appears to be right in the middle of the road in terms of what economists think. Both Economy.com and Global Insight, those are the two largest economic consulting firms in the world. These two firms are both suggesting that the U.S. economy needs a stimulus plan of about $800 billion. The big question, though, is won't this stimulus plan increase the deficit? Well, the short answer is yes. But the conventional wisdom now among economists is that the risk of doing nothing is greater than the potential risk of this large deficit. Now, the answer, we're just going to have to wait and see what history shows. Now, the current guidelines for effective fiscal policy are that fiscal policy be timely, temporary, and targeted. So that's why we had this big emphasis on tax cuts, which can immediately be sent to the consumers, and identifying projects that are ready to roll. So that is why these kinds of things are being included in the fiscal policy. The bottom line, I think, is that President Obama's economic policy is probably right in the middle of the road in terms of the kinds of things that he is suggesting. It's probably not too different from what McCain would have proposed had he won the election. Now, what about here in Montana? The important thing to remember about the Montana economy and this recession is that all the big changes and all the big announced layoffs have just occurred in the last couple of months. Most of them have not yet shown up in the data. Now, the only really current data that we have are monthly employment estimates. And the problem with these monthly employment estimates is that they can be revised, sometimes significantly. But anyway, let's look at the current data and see where we are. This is the percent change in employment during 2008, starting with December 2007, going out to December 2008. You can see where the recession was declared, and here's the bench line. Here is the U.S. employment. You can see that it started turning negative in July, and there were big declines in November and December. Here's Montana. At first glance, it looks like Montana has roughly the same kind of trend at the U.S. as the U.S. But in fact, only one industry in Montana has actually experienced significant declines right now. That's construction. When we look at the non-construction sector, we see that only in December, and only by a little bit, has employment turned negative. So in other words, we have, and that's the problem we as economists and forecasters are facing right now. We have a number of job layoff announcements and closures, but they haven't yet shown up in the data. Now, one way we can kind of summarize the current economic situation in Montana is to look at our basic industries and see what's going on here. Those of you who have come to past Economic Outlook seminars have seen this slide almost every year. These are the important sectors of the Montana economy. They are the movers and shakers. They are the ones who have been responsible for Montana's economic trends for the past 60 years. Let's look at each one individually. Non-resident travel. We had a decline in 2008, and we're probably going to have another decline in 2009. Mining. This is where all the announcements have taken place, but no layoffs have yet occurred. We've had announcements at the Troy mine up near Libby, the Stillwater mine, which is the largest mine in the state. That's out just west of Billings. Manufacturing. Wood products industry is the one where we have experienced significant layoffs and permanent closures. The permanent closures are just here in Missoula with Stimson closing both facilities out at Bonner. There have been other announcements in the wood products industry. Most of those have been up in the Kalispell area. But the bad news has now extended to the other sectors of Montana manufacturing. Columbia Falls aluminum plant announced that it will close in February. Semi-Tool up in Kalispell has announced that there are going to be layoffs. The shoe that we're waiting to see if it drops is what happens to high-tech manufacturing down in the Bozeman area. But once again, these layoff announcements in other manufacturing have been announced, but they haven't taken place yet. Agriculture. This is the one area where we got some good news. Wheat prices are down from their peak, but they're certainly above what they were years ago. But the cattle side of Montana agriculture does continue to be weak. The federal government, it remains a buffer, continues to be a stable buffer. But this year, we've got two additional factors that are affecting our economy. Construction. Construction is not exactly a basic industry because much of construction is financed with local funds. Construction was very, very strong in places like Flathead County and Gallatin County. And construction and real estate employment continues to plummet. Finally, there's Montana consumer sentiment. Now, we measure Montana consumer sentiment in exactly the same way that University of Michigan measures U.S. consumer sentiment. We just got our numbers for December 2008. Montana consumer sentiment is now at an all-time low. And that helps us to explain some of the things we see in the data, because late in 2008, we noticed real weakness in retail trade and services. So we started to see a decline in the derivative industries before the decline in the basic industries. The decline in Montana consumer sentiment explains that very well. So let's put it all together. What's our forecast? We are forecasting statewide growth of about 0.5% during 2009. That's the slowest growth since 1988. There's a good chance that we might be too optimistic. When we did our special presentation before the legislature, they were pushing us, what's the probability of distribution associated with that estimate? I think it's just as likely that we have a decline of 0.5% as we do an increase of 0.5%. On the other hand, it could be that the recovery during 2010, 11, and 12 might be a little more robust than our forecast shows. There is a bright side. Here we have the price of copper. This is short-run data, and you always have to be careful when you're looking at short-run data. There's copper for the last 7 days. There's the price of copper over the last month. Here's the price of platinum. That's what they produce at the Stillwater mine. Here's a little longer run. Now, it's always dangerous to look at very short-run data, but it may be that we are at the end of this slide in terms of commodity prices. And this brings us to the longer run good news. The underlying conditions worldwide haven't changed. Here we've got that very familiar graph that you've been seeing year after year about the run-up in commodity prices. This is the way the world looked a year ago. This is what happened during 2008. If, in fact, we are at a trough now, the price of copper and the price of commodities are about where they were at the end of 2005 or beginning of 2006, which was an all-time high at that time. Now, why is that important? Worldwide, the fastest economic growth in the world continues to be in the developing countries, even taking into account the recent worldwide recession. And again, why is that important? It's important because the developing countries are different from us. Developing countries are much more dependent on manufacturing than the United States. What are the major inputs into manufacturing? Energy and commodities. So that's why we continue to be optimistic about the long-run future of Montana's commodity industries and energy industries. Put it all together, where are we? 2009 is not going to be a good year for the Montana economy. It's quite possible that we will see negative growth during 2009 for the first time since the 1980s. What should we be looking for over the next couple of months to kind of gauge how bad this recession is going to be in Montana? Number one, how many of these planned or announced curtailments and layoffs actually materialize? Number two, what happens to commodity prices? Do they continue back down, or do they stabilize or maybe increase? Number three, what happens to construction? Does it continue to decline and be depressed, or is there a recovery in construction? So those are the kind of things we should be looking for in order to gauge how the Montana economy is faring during this recession. Let's narrow our focus a bit. Let's look at Missoula. What we're going to do now is look specifically at how the Missoula economy performed during the last two recessions. That can give us a feel for what is happening to the Missoula economy and maybe an inkling to how we're going to be faring during this recession. Now let's start with the 1990 recession. It officially began in July 1990. And again, we are going to be looking at monthly employment data. Here's the benchmark. This is what the U.S. economy was looking like during the 1990 recession. Notice that it was a V-shaped recession with a relatively rapid recovery after the trough in in the middle of 1991. And notice that employment is kind of a lagging indicator. Employment does not turn downward or does not start decelerating until the recession actually begins. Here's Montana. The Montana data doesn't begin until 1991, but you can clearly see that Montana does not have the same shape as the U.S. For the state as a whole, Montana missed the 1990 recession. Here's Missoula. Missoula did not miss the 1990 recession. You can see, you can see the deceleration in 1991 and the strong recovery in 1992. This was probably the last of the traditional recessions here in Missoula. Traditionally, what would happen is that the U.S. economy would go into a recession, housing and building would slow down. That would affect the wood products industry here in Missoula, and that's how the recession was transferred to Missoula. 1990 was the last time that happened, because beginning in the late 1990s, timber supply, rather than timber demand, timber supply became the major factor affecting the wood products industry. Let's look at the 2001 recession. You can see at the national level, it's got a different profile. The recovery was much longer and slower than the earlier one. Here is Montana. Notice that Montana, again, for the most part, missed the 2001 recession. Here is Missoula. You can see now, again, that Missoula missed the 2001 recession. The 1990 recession, again, was the last of the traditional ones. So unfortunately, though, Missoula is not going to miss this recession. Turn to page 8 in your briefing book. Look at figure 2. That's employment in Missoula. You can see that employment in Missoula decelerated dramatically late in 2007. So even before the recession was declared, we had a dramatic slowdown in employment. Notice that during 2008, the first half of 2008, we essentially had no employment growth. I think some of that decline during the last half of 2008 is probably going to be revised so that we will probably have no growth in Missoula employment since the beginning of 2008. What happened? It's really pretty easy to explain. The Stimson closed the Bonner plant in the middle of 2007 and the sawmill in 2008. That was a loss of about 350 jobs. There were also declines in transportation, primarily trucking. And as Steve said earlier, trucking and transportation tends to be very related to the U.S. business cycle. Less things that are being produced, less things that are being transported. But there are some other very worrisome signs in the Missoula economy. During the first half of 2008, there were actual declines in wholesale trade, non-resident travel, and professional and business services here in Missoula County. And during the latter part of 2008, there's a pretty good indication that retail trade employment actually declined in Missoula. This is the first time I have ever seen that happen. For the last several years, I've been not warning, but I've been stating that there's been a deterioration in Missoula's role as a regional trade center. That represents the non-residents who come to Missoula to shop, see a doctor or dentist, or do other business. And this has also been happening in Billings. Billings' role as a regional trade center has diminished. What has happened is that second-order trade centers, like Hamilton and like Kalispell, have been growing very rapidly. Why drive all the way to Missoula when you can be doing your shopping in Kalispell? So this is one of the long-term things that we observe in the data that I think pose a very significant risk to the Missoula economy. Now look at figure 6. That's our forecast for Missoula. We probably experienced a decline during 2008. We're forecasting much slower growth in the next couple of years. One of the reasons why we're forecasting slower overall growth in the next couple of years is this deterioration in Missoula's role as a regional trade center. We have a number of people here from Ravalli County. Very quickly, let's look at Ravalli County. Turn to page 15. Remember, the unique thing about Ravalli County economy is that so much of it is dependent on commuters, those people who live in Ravalli County but work in Missoula. Look down in Figure 5, you can see that commuters account for almost half of the economic base in Ravalli County. If you look at Figure 2, you can see that we are also forecasting slower growth in the Ravalli County economy. That's due to several reasons. Construction was unusually strong in Ravalli County, and that is going to probably take a long time to recover. Second, the slower growth in Ravalli County to a certain extent reflects the slower growth in Missoula County, again, because of the large number of commuters who live in Ravalli County and work in Missoula. And third, there's probably going to be fewer people moving to Ravalli County because the good home sites near, in the north portion of the county, those home sites are already taken. So new commuters going into Ravalli County keep having to go further south and incur longer and longer transportation commutes. So with that, I'd like to end and answer any questions you might have. Questions?
Quiet in the room. Question for Paul. This right here.
Point of clarification on that slide you had that said 90% of, I didn't hear what you said, that you didn't have construction on it, which surprised me. The slide that said 90% of. The slide that said 90% of things that were contributing to something about the economy, I didn't quite catch that.
Is your question, why is construction not a basic industry?
Yes.
Or a basic industry needs to be bringing money in from the outside, new money into an area. Much of construction is financed locally. Only to the extent that construction is financed externally is construction a basic industry. That's really a hard determination to know. So that's why construction has always been hard to classify. Is it basic? Is it derivative? So what we do is we analyze construction separately. Does that?
It does, but it leads to another question, which is the importance of second homes and people moving here for retirement, who want people to aren't working here. And I assume that's down diminished dramatically in the last year.
Is your question, what's the role of retirement, retirees in the economy?
Yeah, presumably that's.
Other than me?
Yes, right. Yes, that's right. In particular,
Yeah.
I assume that's diminished dramatically in the last year.
Yeah, even though it's often mentioned, retirement migration is simply not very important here in Montana. The number of retirees moving into the state about equals the number of retirees moving out. Only in 2 parts of the state, or 3 parts of the state, Flathead County, Ravalli County, and what's the county that Red Lodge is in? Carbon County. Those are the only 3 areas where there are significant retirement communities.
Other questions for Paul?
Yes, sir.
The spike in gas prices affected resident travel in 2008. It also affected real estate sales outside of the urban areas. Would you comment on what you think in the next 18 months energy costs will, specifically gas prices, will do, and what the effect might be on the economy?
The question is, what will energy prices do in the next 18 months? I haven't the slightest idea. There's a lot of people who've made very bad predictions. But if energy prices do go back up to where they are, they're going to have exactly the same kind of negative effects you've outlined. And Norma's going to be talking about the effect of energy prices on non-resident travel in just a minute. And that's obviously one of the reasons why we're getting slower growth in Ravalli County, is that the commutes are getting more and more expensive.
We have time for one more question for Paul. Right here.
Do you see a difference in the tax cuts that were done, like by Ronald Reagan, where it was actually cuts to the rates and things for folks, as opposed to what really aren't tax cuts now? They're
stimulus or rebates, things like that, taxes are actually going to go up on higher income individuals. Do you see a difference in how that works out in a stimulus program?
Do you understand that? Are you talking about President Obama's stimulus tax cuts, or?
Yeah, they talk about tax cuts now, but it's really rebates.
I think he's talking tax rebates, not tax cuts.
Right.
And the argument is that the trouble with increased government spending is that it takes so long to get that in the pipeline and get those projects underway that you can implement tax cuts faster than you can implement increases in government spending. I just said the wrong word again. You can implement tax rebates faster than you can implement increased spending. Is that where you're heading?
Well, I'm just wondering, I understand that part of it, but you're actually going to be raising taxes on higher income individuals who are generally creating jobs in the long run. So to me, it seems like I don't know if it'll have the same effect as actual tax cuts, as in tax rate cuts.
I think that's one of the things we're going to have to wait and see how that plays itself out.
Okay, well, Paul will be around during the breaks and also monitoring around into that. So perhaps if you have some other questions, you could question. Paul, thank you very much.